Thomas threw me off yesterday, and I did some research last night. And actually, there are now 59 breast milk exchanges, not for profit, in 30 countries in the world, and there's 5 commercial ones. And there is even a company that exports breast milk from India to Australia. The economics literature on this is very, very thin. There is a large literature in nutrition and health. So if you're looking for a topic for a dissertation, there's actually stuff to be studied. That's not what we're going to talk about today. We talked about that yesterday. I have a little bit left of the introduction on ethics and stuff. I did not talk about sustainability at all. As Key says, sustainability is hot. I'm going to talk about where it comes from, the analytical approach to it, as well as the current status of sustainability, and then we're going to talk about externalities and that sort of stuff. I'm not behind, by the way. This was all planned. I think the best definition of sustainability is actually by the males. You see here, he is still the same old ugly guy. She is a bit younger than I showed her last week. And they wrote in 1857, if the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to the things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or a better population, I sincerely hope, for the sake of posterity, that we will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. So essentially what he says is, still a classical economist still believes that there are hard constraints on the size of the economy. But they also say, actually, we should not seek that limit at all, but we should stop before that. And we should do so for the sake of our children and grandchildren. Not their children and grandchildren, because they did not have any, but for the future generation. Now, if we then move back 130 years into the future, Gro Harlem Brundtland for the United Nations chaired the committee, and they came up with a much shorter definition of sustainability, and they said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And essentially everybody has embraced this notion. Sustainability is front and center to all government policy, to a lot of corporate policy. Also, the University of Sussex has embraced sustainability as one of its overarching goals. And the reason lies in the obvious attractiveness of this particular notion, right? This is what we would like. We would like to live our life such that we don't compromise the next generations in their ability to lead their life, right? That is obviously attractive. At least to most people it is obviously attractive. One of the reasons that this definition or this notion of sustainability is so very popular is because it actually doesn't, it's appealing at an intuitive level, but what do we actually mean by it, right? What does needs actually mean? It's not a vague notion of what it is, and obviously sustenance is a need and shelter is a need, but definitely after a day of teaching, I really need to hang out in front of the telly for a couple of hours to recuperate. Is that a need, or is that just something that I want? Right? And when we say compromising needs, what do we really mean by that? Do we mean that those needs cannot be fulfilled, or maybe they choose to do other things that we define as needs? who are actually we to decide what the needs of the future generations might be, right? When you start sort of looking at it closer, it actually doesn't mean a whole lot specifically. Now, I think that's a good thing. This is diplomacy as it should be. You should come up with a turn of phrase that everybody can agree on, right? That is what international diplomacy does. But that is, of course, not what academics do. Academics sort of look at these words and say, what do they mean? I think that is entirely wrong. Billy Bragg said it better than I did. The temptation to take the precious things we have apart to see how they work must be resisted, for they never fit together again. But that is exactly what I'm going to do, because we are at a university, and that is what academics do. And I'm going to talk about 3 alternative notions of sustainability. I'm going to talk about weak sustainability and strong sustainability. I'm not going to talk about in-between sustainability, because that's just a trivial combination of the two. And I'm going to talk about sustainability as a social construct, and then I'm going to end up with Tim Bergen, as we should, right? So weak sustainability first. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, Jack, at the moment, Pazzi, said, well, this really means that utilities should not fall, right? That is what we mean by sustainability. That future generations are not worse off than we are. And then John Hartwig sort of said, yeah, but utility is a very sort of elusive concept, and it cannot be measured. It can be defined, but it cannot be measured. So let's focus on consumption instead, and we should say that consumption should not fall. Hartwig also formulated the Hartwig rule, and essentially what it says that a constant level of consumption can be maintained perpetually. And that is, of course, the important bit of sustainability. From an environmental endowment, if all the scarcity rents, net price profits, and so on, from resource extraction are invested in other capital. So essentially what he says, that what we should do, if we want to be sustainable, is to keep the principle intact and then live off the service flow alone. We should not be reducing our assets. But he also very clearly said that if we are sort of reducing our natural capital, then we should use the proceeds of that to increase our human-made capital, so that the service flow in total, measured in consumption, stays the same or increases, right? That is essentially the Hartwig rule. That should not run down your assets, but it is fine to switch from one class of assets to another class of assets, right? That is the Hartwig rule. Now, Bob Solow got involved in this discussion as well and said, well, if we live on a finite planet, and we do, then the prerequisite that consumption should not fall means that consumption should stay constant. That just follows from the resource constraint that we live under. And that is a pretty tough prescription, right? That means that you guys should not be richer than your parents. Richness broadly defined, and you may object to that, right? Now, these 3 alternative definitions actually sort of like seem to put sort of concrete stuff on the Brundtland definition, but it does not actually tell us everything, because we did not say how we measure utility or consumption. Is this the average consumption? Is this the median consumption? Is this the consumption of every single person on the planet? It also doesn't specify at what timescale things should not fall. It's that time of year when infectious disease go around, so some of you will have a flu, right? And you will feel pretty miserable, but that will be over in a week. That obviously is not a violation of sustainability, but is a recession of 2 years or a depression of 10 years, is that a violation of sustainability? Or are we really talking about, well, this should be over a prolonged period, say 100 years? They are essentially silent about this. But an important aspect of all three alternative definitions, Pesci, Hartwig and Solow, is that essentially we allow for substitution. What matters is that the flow of consumption or utility stays constant or is non-decreasing, but it doesn't really matter where it comes from. So, say you enjoy walking in the woods, right? That is a service flow from a natural capital. According to the definitions of weak sustainability, is perfectly fine if we cut down all the forest and replace the forest with a virtual reality experience of you feeling as if you are walking in the forest. And that may even be better, because then we can sort of edit out all the nasty things that you may encounter in the forest, like midgets and those sort of things, right? That is the key assumption in weak sustainability, that substitution between different capital stocks is allowed. There's a few other definitions that sort of say, well, I don't know how to define utility, I don't know how to define consumption, and I don't want sort of this paternalistic thing, because we are talking about utility and consumption over generations. I don't want this sort of notion that we, the present generation, prescribe how future generations should define consumption or utility, because they may have completely different views on this. And if you don't believe me, just go talk to your parents, and they view things differently than you do, right? They appreciate different things than you do. Definitely true with me and my parents, or me and my children for that matter. So Talbot Pates and again Bob Solow sort of said, now we should just focus on production opportunities and not focus on consumption. We should just make sure that the production function sort of is able to deliver whatever consumption future generations may desire. Does not answer any of the other questions and still allows for substitution. Now, that is weak sustainability. Strong sustainability takes a very different point of view. This is rooted in the deep ecology of Aldo Leopold, Arne Naess, and also the current Pope has very strong tendencies towards this. And essentially what strong sustainability says is that you cannot substitute between different kinds of capital stocks. And if you take this very strictly, then essentially nothing you can do is okay. Even dying is not okay, right? Because if you die, there's three things we can do with your, well, let's say there's three things we can do with your body. We can bury you, right? And then you take up a piece of land, right? And obviously that takes away from the capital stock of land, so that is not okay. We can burn you, and then you add CO2 to the atmosphere, so you change that atmospheric stock, or we can let you just lie about and rot, and then you emit methane, and that would not be good either for the atmosphere. So dying is obviously not something that is allowed, right? And essentially, if you say we're going to maintain every little capital stock that there is, then essentially we freeze time, right? That's essentially what the physicist would say. Well, if you're going to take this literally, then we should stop time, right? And the second law of thermodynamics, which is the same thing. So in practice, people who say this say, well, there must be some form of substitution. And then the question is, of course, what sort of substitution? So earlier this week, or maybe late last week, a discussion flared up around Hinkley C. So that's the new nuclear power plant in Somerset, and nuclear power plants need to take in a lot of water for cooling. The reason that they're often built on the coast is because they take in seawater, and obviously there has to be infrastructure for that. And there is actually, don't say this out loud, there is an EU directive that says whenever you take away a piece of land, and whenever you take away a piece of natural land, a piece of nature, you need to compensate for that somewhere else. And that law, even though it's an EU law, is still on the UK books. Don't tell the Brexiteers, please. And under that law, Hinkley C now, because it's taking away fish habitat by building this cooling water inlet, has to create fish habitats someplace else. And they're now talking about flooding parts of the Somerset levels in order to do so. Is this a one-for-one compensation? Ecologists actually disagree. The locals are sort of like very, very upset about this, right? Because they say we have enough sea already in Somerset and we don't have enough agricultural land in Somerset. I don't think that's true. But the locals are definitely not happy with it. In other similar projects, they cut down a forest somewhere in the north of England and they're planting forests in Hungary as compensation, right? Is that sort of an allowable type of compensation, or is this just greenwashing? And if you're a deep ecologist, if you believe in strong sustainability, you need to have an answer to these questions. Another important question is, of course, what do we mean by maintaining a stock, or what do we actually mean by a stock? Are we talking about entire habitats? Are we talking about individual species? Very different outcomes. Or are we talking about maintaining individual genes rather than species? A lot of people are upset when they learn that polar bears are not a species. And when the polar bear goes, it's a subspecies of the brown bear, just as the grizzly is. And actually, when the polar bear goes extinct, we don't lose a species. We don't lose many genes at all. And actually, we can breed them back right away, because polar bears are just white brown bears. It's just hair pigmentation that is the difference between a polar bear and a brown bear. Therefore, if you say we're going to maintain genes, then there is absolutely no problem with the polar bear going extinct. A lot of people would be upset if you say, well, that is the implication, and they say, no, we need to maintain individual species, or in this case, subspecies. Another question here is, of course, what do we do with viruses and pests? You all vividly recall COVID-19, right? And you really would want to eradicate and wipe out the stock of COVID-19 viruses. It would all make us feel a lot better. Similarly, for such diseases as smallpox, probably the world would be better off if we eradicate the 5 remaining stocks of smallpox, 2 in Russia and 3 in the USA. In hopefully safe labs, right? But if you're a deep ecologist, then wiping out an entire species is of course not allowed, right? So there's deep questions here, no clear answers. Other people have said, well, let's forget about the stock themselves and let's just focus on the services that are derived from those stocks, and that is what we want to maintain. Where you may sort of define these services from a human perspective, and then we're back into a sort of an anthropocentric viewpoint. And substitution is again allowed, or you may say, well, we're actually going to define these services much more broadly, and we're also going to look at the services to other species. Nice conceptually, but what do we mean by services? At what time scale? At what spatial scale? Importantly, we again introduce some sort of substitution here between capital stocks, right? So, key difference between weak sustainability and strong sustainability is, do you want to maintain everything roughly as it is, or do you allow for substitution where if you lose one good thing, you make sure that you get another good thing in return? That is the key distinction between weak and strong sustainability. Now, the third notion of sustainability is that sustainability is a social construct. That is, sustainability is not some sort of objective law of nature or some God-given mandate. That sustainability is as we define it. Now, this is obviously true. Some people have taken this a step further and say, well, I don't really care about the outcome, but what really matters is that we get this discussion around sustainability correct. That is, it takes a much more procedural viewpoint rather than a consequential one. But that is just a call for wider participation. That is just people saying, well, everybody cares about sustainability. I care about direct democracy, so I'm going to pretend that direct democracy will lead to sustainability, and then I achieve my aim. And we see a lot of that stuff. And that is perhaps better seen through the first, or sort of sustainability 2.0. And that is that after a while people said, well, sustainability is all about care for the environment. Well, that's not the only thing that is important. So people redefined sustainability into the 3 pillars of sustainability. That is, what matters is environmental quality, what matters is economic growth, and what matters is the distribution of economic resources. And those are the 3 pillars of sustainability, or those were the 3 pillars of sustainability for a while. Now, I have no objection to any of these objectives, but of course, if you have 3 objectives that may be contradictory, then pretending that they're one and the same, of course, just hides the trade-offs that you need to make, right? It just obscures what you want to do. And sometimes that's politically useful to obscure what you're doing, but analytically it is not. Now, as I said, this was Sustainability 2.0. We're now in Sustainability 3.0. And at the moment we have 17 sustainability goals. And here they are. And I'll take you through them. The UN is very proud on for having done this. They had a major launch. That is Ed Sheeran there. This was at the time that Ed Sheeran could still sing very, very fast. And he was the only one who could get all 17 definitions into a 2-minute song. That is why he was there to launch them. And as I said, everybody has embraced this. We at the University of Sussex have to tell the centre which of the 17 sustainability development goals we are teaching. And I told them I'm teaching all 17, and here we go. And there are really 17. I'm not going to read them all. I color-coded them, right? So according to the 3 pillars, there's sort of social stuff, there's economic stuff, and there's environmental stuff. I recall that sustainability started with the environment, right? So the red ones are social, the blue ones are economic growth, and the green ones are environmental. So sustainability development goal number 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Absolutely do that. Don't know why this is called sustainability. End hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote agriculture. And then sort of like in the definition of sustainability, they refer back to sustainable, right? So we have sort of this tautology there. Sustainability is to be sustainable. The aim of sustainability is to be sustainable. Like, yeah, I'm not sure what that means. Ensure healthy life and promote well-being for all at all ages. These are all very worthy goals, right? And then you can read on, and there's a lot of social stuff. There's also a little bit of economic growth. We should also promote sustained economic growth. That's the first sort of economic goal that slips in. And then when you move to the second half of the table, actually some green stuff starts popping up, right? And you also have like the tried ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. The aim of sustainability is to be sustainable, right? But there is some environmental stuff as well. Take urgent action against climate change, conserve the oceans, seas and marine resources, but also the terrestrial ecosystems. But really what you see here is of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, only 3 are environment, 1 is economic, and then the remaining 13 are really about development, which is good, right? It just does not add up to, it's completely different from where it started, right? It started in the environmental movement, not here. Now, final words about this. In 1952, Jan Tinbergen, who you see here at the top, is the first Nobel laureate in economics, published a book about public policy, and he showed what actually was relatively trivial, that if you have n problems, what you need is n instruments to solve those problems. Some people say you need, if you have n problems, you need n or more solutions. I think that is wrong. And I think that Tinbergen wrote this. And this of course follows immediately from Lagrange's optimization. The way to sort of like intuitively think about this is that if you're driving a car, then it is good to have one driver. Because if you have 2 people with 2 steering wheels, then you can probably negotiate going straight, but taking a corner is actually very difficult if you have 2 people trying to turn the car. Similarly, if you have 2 cars with 1 steering wheel between them, then again you can probably go straight, but taking a corner is very, very difficult unless the road is very, very wide, right? So if you want to steer 2 cars, you need 2 steering wheels. If you want to steer 100 cars, you need 100 steering wheels. If you want to steer 1 car, you need 1 steering wheel, right? That is essentially what Lagrange and Tinbergen showed. Now, by sort of like taking sustainability and piling on all sorts of stuff that are undoubtedly good, you're just obscuring this, right? Now you can say, I strive for sustainability, but you can pick any of the 17. And you may be confused and saying, well, it's all the same, which it obviously is not. And I mean, one very clear counterexample is if you go for sustainable agriculture or environmentally friendly agriculture, organically produced food is more expensive than conventionally produced food. Because it takes more labor, it takes has lower yields, and so on and so forth. And if food is more expensive, then particularly poorer people are either hurt in their budget or have to eat less than they should, right? So there's an obvious conflict here between doing things that are good for the environment and doing things that are good for the poorer half of society. And by saying, well, it's all sustainable, you actually obscure this very real trade-off. And you may be lured into thinking, it's all the same problem, so I just need one solution and everything will be fine. No, if you have 17 different goals, then you need 17 different policy interventions, right? And by calling everything sustainable, I think you're just hiding things and obscuring things, right? So, I taught you all 17 sustainable development goals in less than 10 minutes. Let's move to week 2. And we're going to talk about externalities and public goods. I'm going to start with a fairly rapid recap of micro, because sometimes people forget. And it sort of matters for what comes next. That is, I'm going to formally introduce externalities and I'm going to formally talk about public goods. And we now start week 2. And I'm going to start with static efficiency and optimality. So, I think I said this last week as well. We say that a situation is Pareto superior to another situation if nobody is worse off and at least somebody is better off, right? That is Pareto superiority. Aristotle, way back when, noted that if you have a trade in which both parties engage voluntarily, knowing full well what they're doing, then that trade can only be mutually advantageous, because why otherwise would you do it? So if you have one woman desperately trying to feed her baby, but has a lot of money, and you have another woman with little money but perhaps excess breast milk, you can come up with a mutually advantageous exchange between the two, right? And such a trade is Pareto improving, right? And this goes back to the very, very, very beginning of economics, right? Aristotle. And last week I also talked about Pareto optimality very briefly, or what we call efficiency or economic efficiency. If you are in a situation where there is no Pareto improving trade possible because you've exhausted all Pareto superior moves, then you are in a Pareto optimum, right? Or Pareto optimum exhaust all Pareto improvements. And then of course we have the first welfare theorem that says that if you have a market without distortions, a perfect market, then that market will deliver a Pareto optimum. That market is efficient, right? So let's make this a little bit more precise. I'm going to look at an economy with two people, A and B, two goods, X and Y, and two inputs into production, L and K, right? And we have a utility function. So both consumers want to consume both goods, A and B. The production of both goods requires both inputs, capital and labor, K and L. So this is all just notation. And then instead of writing sort of the U, the X, and so on and so forth, I'm going to use a slightly different notation. A subscript means a first partial derivative, right? So U sub X is the first partial derivative of U to X, right? That is just to make things a little bit more palatable, because I'm only interested in relative marginals, and then you have ratios of ratios, and that just gets very messy, right? So this is just notation. The first subcondition for economic efficiency is efficiency in consumption. And that says that the ratio of marginal utilities should be equal. So the marginal valuation of good X by consumer A to the marginal utility of good Y for consumer A should equal the same ratio for consumer B, right? That is essentially what this says. Now this is known for reasons that are historical as the marginal rate of substitution. And I think it's easier to see this if you say, well, what if we violate this condition? What could we do? Well, if the starting point is that consumer A values consumer X at the margin 5 times more than he values a good Y, so the initial ratio is 5 to 1, and for consumer B it's the other way around, that C values at the margin good Y 5 times higher than good X, then they could swap, right? Because A could give up 1 Y and therefore loses 1 util, but if he gets 5X in return, right, he is better off. But consumer B gets 5Y, so C is 5 better off, 5 utils better off, but of course he has to give up 1X, but that is worth only 1 util to her, right? So C is also better off by 4. So this is a mutually advantageous exchange, right? So efficiency in consumption is a prerequisite for overall economic efficiency. Similarly, we need efficiency in production, and that is that the marginal product for making good X over labor and capital inputs is the same as the marginal product, the ratio of marginal products for making good Y, labor and capital inputs. And this is known again for historical reasons as the marginal rate of transformation. And if this condition is violated, then again what we have is that you can shift some capital from the production of X to the production of Y, and then some labor in the other direction, and then you make more of both X and Y, right? So again, this is a prerequisite for overall economic efficiency. If this condition is violated, then you can just increase total output without increasing inputs, right? And then we have product mix efficiency or allocative efficiency, and that says that the marginal rate of substitution should equal the inverse of the marginal rate of transformation. And it's the inverse because it's a transaction cost, it's an opportunity cost, right? This is a bit more difficult to understand, but essentially what you can do if this condition is violated, then you can rearrange the inputs of capital and labor such that you make not necessarily more of everything, but a better mix of the things that you would make, a better mix so that it just satisfies all the consumers in the economy, right? And if you meet these 3 conditions, consumption efficiency, production efficiency, product mix efficiency, then you are economically efficient, right? This is still just micro. Now, last week I also said, well, this is a Pareto optimum. This does not necessarily mean that we are in a social optimum, right? Because we start with this initial allocation, and you can rearrange the initial allocation and you would still find the Pareto optimum. And what you may have, if you are able to define a social welfare function, then you can impose that and choose between your Pareto optima, right? So this is for a barter economy. Now let's look at a market economy, where instead of just marginal utilities, we also have price ratios. So if we introduce money into this economy, then consumption efficiency requires that the ratio of, the ratio of marginal utility of consumer A of consuming good X relative to consuming good Y should equal the price of X over the price of Y. And again, if this condition is violated, let's assume that the utility ratio is 1 to 5 and the price ratio is 5 to 1. Then what you as a consumer can do is you can sell one X. That leads to a loss in utility of 1, but you gained 5, let's call them pounds. And with those 5 pounds, you can buy 25 Ys. And yes, you lost 1, but you gained 24, so you're better off, right? So if this condition is violated, you're obviously not in an optimum, right? So that holds for consumer A. The same holds for consumer B. And if we are in a market where everybody pays the same price, we all go to the same supermarket, then consumers face the same prices, and we sort of have that the ratio, the marginal rate of substitution for consumer A is equal to the marginal rate of substitution for consumer B, right? If they face the same prices in the market, right? You can do the same on input markets, right? Same sort of reasoning, and provided that everybody pays the same wages and everybody pays the same for renting capital, then you get production efficiency as well, and you then start manipulating the whole thing. Then you could also say, well, in a price, in an economy with money, with a numeraire, you can also establish product mix efficiency. Right? Straight micro. Now the condition here, of course, is that the market is perfect, right? And the question is the market perfect? And markets are efficient if and only if, that's what the double F means, if markets are complete, that is everything that matters either for utility or for production is traded on some market, right? Markets has to be complete, property rights have to be fully assigned. There are no public goods. All goods are rivalrous and excludable. I'll come back to that after the break. And there are no externalities, right? All that is unintended, uncompensated effects on third parties. Other conditions for market perfection are, of course, that markets are perfectly competitive. There's no natural monopolies, long run average costs are non-decreasing, and so on and so forth. There's no market power of any sort. We also need to assume that all markets have perfect information. The reason for that is that because otherwise people would make mistakes and they would buy things at the wrong price because they don't know what offer there is. Related to this, sometimes the same, sometimes separated, is also that every exchange has to be costless. So essentially, if you want to buy something and you discover that it is on sale at a lower price in Edinburgh, then you can just get it from Edinburgh, right? Without any additional cost, right? It's only then that price ratios are the same for everybody. And price ratios being the same means that price ratios are the same for the people who live in Brighton and for the people who live in Edinburgh, right? Now, do we violate these conditions? Yes, obviously. a lot of the things that we care about, such as clean air, such as wilderness, are not bought and sold on markets, right? So markets are incomplete. Many resources are public goods, and climate is one of them, or open access. And ocean fisheries is a prime example of an open access resource. Many resources are traded on markets with a lot of market power. True for agriculture, true for the land market, true for the housing market, true for a lot of minerals, and so on and so forth. And then other environmental issues are externalities, right? And then the question is, but we're going to come back to that after the break, is what does this do to the market, right? How inefficient are we, and what can we do to restore efficiency to the market? That is the first thing after the break. And then the second thing is I'm going to talk about public goods and why public goods are a problem for markets, right? So we're going to break for 10 minutes, reconvene at shortly before 11. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to do the core of environmental economics. I'm going to talk about externalities, and I'm going to talk about public goods. And I'm going to start with externalities. So an externality is an unintended, uncompensated impact of an economic activity on a third party. That is my preferred definition. As you can see in the book, there's actually a great many definitions of externalities, and the definition is also shifted over time. I think that this is the best and most concise one, not because it's mine, but because it is. So there's three components to the definition. The first is unintended. We put pseudo-hormones in our washing machine because it cleans our clothes. We don't put pseudo-hormones in our detergents because it turns female frogs male, right? That is not why we do this. We want clean clothes. Similarly, we burn coal to make electricity. We do not burn coal to emit sulfur and generate acid rain, right? That is not the purpose of the burning of the coal. The purpose is making electricity. So that is the unintended. The uncompensated is that there is no consequence to the person who makes the decision of this action. You can dump the sulfur, or you used to be able to dump the sulfur freely into the atmosphere. You can still do in many countries around the world. You can, in the UK, freely dump pseudo-hormones into the sewerage system, right? That is absolutely legal and absolutely allowed, and you don't pay anything for this service. So that is uncompensated. And then in a lot of definitions that I review in the book, the sort of the third party element is missing. I think it should be there because there's also such a thing as an internality, which is essentially an externality that you do to yourself, which has to do with such things as addiction to, say, gambling or alcohol. That is something that you know is bad for you, but somehow you can't stop yourself. Those sort of things that do not affect other people but affect yourself, we nowadays call internalities. And in order to distinguish internalities from externalities, I think the third party should be part of the definition. A third party in the sense, an economic agent who has nothing to do with the economic activity or the economic transaction that is taking place, right? So that is why I think this is the best and most succinct, the most complete as well as the most succinct definition of an externality. Externalities come by different names. Nowadays, most people say externality, but in older literature, you would find external effects. you would find external cost, you would find external diseconomy. That is all the same thing, right? And of course, there can also be external benefits or external economies or positive externalities, right? And then actually, if you go back to the very first textbook treatment of externalities, it's actually Mead, right? Sorry. His example, prime example of an externality is a beekeeper. So a beekeeper keeps bees to make honey. That's the purpose of beekeeping. But as an external effect of this, the bees also pollinate the orchard next door, right? And allow the farmer next door to grow apples, right? That is the first textbook example of an externality. And that is, of course, beneficial, right? So externalities may be positive or negative depending on whether the end effect is positive. Of course, here we're talking about environmental economics, where basically all externalities we're talking about are negative, but it does not mean that all externalities are negative, right? They just happen to be all negative in this context. If we put a tax on the externality, then we say that the externality becomes internalized, right? So, what do externalities do to efficiency? So, let's look at production efficiency first, right? So what we have is at the marginal rate of transformation. So we're interested in making product X, and then we have the marginal productivity of labor and capital in making X, right? And the ratio of that should equal the marginal social cost of using L relative to the marginal social cost of using capital K, right? That is the condition for production efficiency. Now, if the marginal cost of using labor is not the price of labor, P sub L, but it is P sub L plus some external effect, EL, then, and the same for capital, right? Then SL and SK, SL over SK is really PL plus EL over PK plus EK. But in the market, if the producer faces not the social cost, but only the prices, so the interest rate and the wage, then the rational entrepreneur would do this, would set the marginal cost or the marginal productivity of one over the other equal to the prices in the market rather than the social cost. So as soon as we are in a situation where the price that you pay on the market does not reflect the social cost, we violate production efficiency, and therefore the market is not efficient, right? And I can do the same with consumption, I can do the same with product mix. I'm going to make the same point for a very simple economy. So we have two producers, X and Y, and the profit of company Y. So we have two things that we make. We also have two companies, X and Y, just to make it simple. So the profit of making Y is, of course, the revenue you get from the Y that you put on the market. And we assume that in order to make good Y, we only have labor input. So this is the price you get, this is the amount you put on the market, so this is your revenue. But then, of course, you have to pay your laborers. So this is your cost, that's the price of labor times the amount of labor that you use, right? And similarly for making X, we only use capital as an input. So the cost is the price of capital times the amount of capital. What we make is how much capital we put in. And then, of course, the revenue is the price of good X, right? And then I introduce an externality here that the production of X also depends on the amount of labor that is used by the other company. Now, this is a very charged example. The reason that it's so very charged is to keep it simple, right? So I have one input only and one product, so that makes it all or two products and two inputs, but they're neatly separated. It just makes the notation a whole lot simpler. And the only example that I could give, that I could think of that would sort of like illustrate this, is that here we have this company and they're only using labor and they're sort of getting in the way of the production of the other goods, but they're not using labor, so they must use driverless transport, right? Driverless cars. But when these guys get to work, they sort of get in the way, they cause congestion, and therefore you see reduced production of the other company, right? As I said, a very stylized, very peculiar example, but this is just to keep the math sort of simple without losing any insight. By the way, it's just that the math is a whole lot simpler. So if we do a private optimization, so company X wants to maximize its profits, and it's a very simple choice. It just needs to choose how much K do I use, right? How much capital do I put in? And then all the rest just follows. So we take d pi dk, so that is px, and then we have the subscript here, right? So this is the first partial derivative of x to k. Revenue is pk, and we have the first order condition that the marginal revenue, p times x, p times xk, is equal to the marginal, or the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, right? We bring the pk to the other side of the equation. Similarly, for company Y, we take the first partial derivative of profit to the only choice that we make, that is how much labor to use. So we find py yl minus pl equals 0. And what we have in the equilibrium is that the market price for good X is the price of capital, that's the only input that you use for making X, over the marginal productivity of that capital, right? So this is a standard arbitrage condition. So this is what these two companies would do when left to their own devices, right? And what you see is that company Y does not at all take into account what it does to company X, because it doesn't care about company X, it only cares about its own profits, right? So let's now do the social optimum. That is, we're not going to maximize pi of x and pi of y, but we're going to maximize the sum of the two, right? So that is the revenue of company X plus the revenue of company Y minus the cost of company X minus the cost of company Y, right? That is the joint profit of the two. Then we're going to take the first partial derivative of the, I did this wrong, here we are. The first partial derivative of the joint profit to one of the two decisions that we make, namely how much capital to use. And what we find is px, first partial derivative of x to k, and this thing does not depend on k, this thing does not depend on k, so we have pk here, and this first order condition is actually the same as you saw on the previous slide, right? And the market price is the same as we saw previously. But now if we take the joint profit and we take the first partial derivative of the joint profit to the other decision that we make, namely how much labor to use, what we find is this thing is still the same, pyYL. This thing does not depend on L, this thing does, but it's linear, so that becomes PL, right? So these two are the same as we had before. But now we have this expression here as well. And this says because the production of X also depends on L, what we have here is the price of X, the marginal revenue, then how our production of X changes at the margin as a function of the pollution or the congestion that we have, and how much that congestion changes if we change the labor input into the production of Y, right? So we have this term popping up. And this term was not on the previous slide. So that also means that in the market price for good Y now has this term in as well, right? And again, I replace the XDM by X sub M and the MDL by M sub L. Right? So the individually rational action delivers a different solution than the collective action, the joint optimization. Now let's return to private action, but introduce a tax, right? And the tax that we're going to introduce is say, well, Y is causing the congestion, and it's the amount of labor that company Y is causing the congestion. It's the amount of labor that drives that congestion. So we're going to introduce a tax there that they have to pay a premium for all the congestion that they cause, right? And the premium is denoted by tau, right? And of course, if tau is 0, we're back into the previous situation. Nothing has changed for company X, so that first order condition is still the same. The cost function for company Y has changed, right? The revenue is still the same, it's PY/YL. Their labor cost is still PL, but now for every unit of labor that they use, they have to pay a tax tau. So they have to subtract that, right? And the first, so this is the first order condition, and then the market solves as this, that the price of good Y reflects not just the price of labor over the marginal productivity of that labor, but also has this tax in, right? And it's a cost, just like labor is a cost, right? Now, if you look back at the joint optimization, right, this is what we wanted. This was the social optimum, or rather the joint optimum of these two companies together, which just assumed to be the entirety of society at the moment, right? We had this condition here, now we have this condition here. So if we set the tax tau equal to the price of good X times how much congestion affects the production of X times how much labor affects congestion, then this individual optimization with a tax returns to the Pareto optimum, right? And this particular tax we call the Pigou tax. So Pigou tax is that tax that exactly restores the social optimum. And in the example that I just gave you, that has this simple equation with these three elements. You can imagine that if I had made a more complex economy, that there would have been many more terms in the Pigou tax, right? And that is why I kept it so simple, right? This is known as the Pigou tax. I think that is unfair. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Pigou definitely was the first to suggest a tax like this, but Pigou was thinking mostly about agglomeration effects rather than external effects. And really the Pigou tax, as we know it, is due to Francis Bator, right, who you see on the left. So really we should be calling it the Bator tax. Spencer Banchev has this paper out where he argues that the reason that it's called the Pigou tax is because the Americans who introduced this into the US discussion about environmental policy needed an eminent Brit to associate it with with their proposals rather than a young American, right? They thought that eminent Brits were just more convincing with policymakers. That's why we call it a Pigou tax. Really, it's a Bato tax. Pigou did introduce a tax like this, and he did it as follows. If the amount of investment in any industry was carried exactly to the point at which the value of the marginal social net product there is equal to the central value of the marginal social net products, the national dividend, so far as that industry is concerned, would be maximized. Disregarding the possibility of multiple maximum positions, I propose for inconvenience to call the investment that would then be made in the industry the ideal investment, and the output that would be obtained the ideal output. Under conditions of simple competition, if in any industry the value of the marginal is, I can't talk anymore. You can read this, right? This is the original definition of the Pigou tax. Note what he does, right? He says that if for every industry in which the value of the marginal social net product is greater than that of the marginal private net product, there will be certain rates of bounty, the granting of which by the state would modify output in such a way as to make the value of the marginal social net product there more nearly equal to the value of the marginal social net product of resources in general. So he first says that we should give bounties, which is the old word for subsidies, right? So he was really thinking of positive externalities, or rather positive agglomeration effects. And only as an afterthought, he throws in sort of the Pigou tax, right? Now, this is how economics used to be taught. Students sometimes complain that we do excessive mathematics. If you read this carefully, multiple times, it says the exact same thing as I just said in maths, right? Now, I personally find this very hard to follow, and I find the maths much easier, but different people have different tastes. The contents here is exactly the same as the few equations that I threw up, right? Read it at leisure. So, this is known as the Pigou tax, right? In policy circles and in general parlance, the Pigou tax is sometimes referred to as the polluter pays principle. That is right and wrong. If you impose a Pigou tax on a negative externality, that is pollution, then indeed the polluter pays, right? That is true. You may lift this to a principle, I have no problem with that. But the polluter pays principle only says that the polluter should pay. The Pigou tax also says how much the polluter should pay, right? So the Pigou tax is a lot more specific than the polluter pays principle. And namely, the amount that the polluter should pay is the damage done at the margin. There's another source of confusion about the Pigou tax, and that actually goes back to, of all people, James Buchanan, right, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on political economy. And you may think that he is very clever, but he got this completely wrong. So a Pigou tax imposes a tax on the polluter, and that is enough to restore efficiency. It doesn't say anything about what should be done with the tax revenue collected. Now, Buchanan thought that you needed to give this money to the victims of the pollution, that compensation should be paid. However, that is not the case, as shown by William Baumol, who did not win the Nobel Prize, even though he should have, not for this, but for other stuff. Baumol showed that this compensation of the victims of the pollution is a lump sum transfer. It is a transfer in the sense of the second welfare theorem rather than compensation in sort of first welfare theorem type of territory. Right? So what matters is that the polluters pay at the margin, and then they will reduce their pollution to the socially optimal amount. That generates a stream of revenue for the government, and the government can decide to give that to the victims, but that would be a transfer that would not affect their margin, their behavior at the margin, right? Or the government can decide to pay off the national debt with this money or something, right? So even though an externality says unintended third party and uncompensated, when we internalizing the externality, that does not automatically generate this compensation, right? That's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it is a bit difficult to understand. I mean, if Buchanan gets it wrong, you shouldn't be ashamed that you find this difficult to grasp when you first encounter it. Public goods, property rights, and so on and so forth, right? Why do I do it like this? Well, I'm gonna do it like this. That's what's going on. Maybe when I have time in the end. So, what are public goods? Again, you should recall this from your micro. So a private good is both rivalrous and excludable, right? And the example that I put up here is an ice cream. And an ice cream is excludable in the sense that if I have bought an ice cream, it is mine and you may not eat it because that would be theft, right? And an ice cream is also rivalrous because once I have eaten the ice cream, you cannot eat it, right? So excludability is you may not, rivalry is you cannot, right? So one is a legal concept about ownership. The other is a physical concept of is it still around, right? So that is rivalry and excludability. Now a public good is neither rivalrous nor excludable. And the example that I give here is the open ocean, right? Or it's maybe the Arctic even. Nobody can tell you not to go, right? You're free to go. And if you go there, it's so big, you're not taking up, you're not preventing anybody else from going. So it's also non-rivalrous, right? And then there are these two mixed types of public-private goods. The first of them is rivalrous but non-excludable, and they are often called open access resources or common goods. And actually in the literature there's quite a bit of confusion about what people really mean by all these things. But the commons, as you would see in every English village a few hundred years ago, was essentially a piece of land where everybody who lived in the village could graze their sheep or their pigs or their cows. And you could not tell another villager not to do this because it was their legal right to do so. So it was not it was not excludable, right? But it is rivalrous because if my sheep eat the grass, your sheep cannot eat the grass, right? And the problem with commons good is that it's in everybody's self-interest to put more sheep on the commons because you internalize the profits, right? If you have more sheep, you have more wool, you have more milk, and so on and so forth, more meat. But the costs are externalized. The cost of overgrazing do not just fall on me, but fall on the entire village, right? So the problem with common goods or open access resources is that they are over exploited. Another example, and I'll show that in a bit, is fisheries, right? Outside the exclusive economic zone, anybody can fish. Nobody can be excluded. But of course, if I catch the fish, you can't, right? Because it's gone. Now, there's also such a thing, sometimes called the club good, sometimes called the congestion good, that is excludable but non-rivalrous. And the example I give here is of a music venue, and the band that you've seen playing was very popular at the time I put it up, but I completely forget who they are. So think of your favorite band, right? So if you want to go see them, you need to buy a ticket, otherwise you can't, right? So obviously you can be excluded from the venue. But once you're inside, your enjoyment of the music, hopefully, does not affect other people, right? So the consumption, once you're in, is non-rivalrous. It's actually a bad example because you may actually start enjoying the interaction of the crowd, right? So those are the four types of goods, right? Pure private, that is what most economic theory assumes. Pure public, and then the two mixed forms, right? The problem with public goods, as I said, is overconsumption. Because you're never paying the real price of using it, because you don't take into account what your consumption does to other people's consumption. And it's under provision because you can't recoup the full price because you cannot exclude people, and therefore why would you provide it in the first place, right? Now, what does this do to demand functions? So, before the break, I said that one condition for economic efficiency is that the marginal rate of substitution must equal to the marginal rate of transformation, right? That's product mix or allocative efficiency. This condition does not hold for public goods. For public goods, the next condition that you see here must hold. And this is due to Paul Samuelson. Actually, he was much, much younger than this when he came up with this. As far as I know, Samuelson is still alive. Is he? I think he's alive and around 102 or so, but don't quote me on that. Really what you need to do, what this says, is that for private goods you can do the standard vertical aggregation of demand, but for public goods you would need so-called horizontal aggregation. So now, how does that work? I never studied economics. I trained as a mathematician before I trained as an economist, and then went straight into the PhD program for economics. So I always struggle with the graphical proofs that people do in economics proper, right? And that's not something that I've ever seen during my studies. We just did the math, right? So this figure is straight from Kolstad's book, right? So we have American names for some reason. The guy is called Brewster. Americans are very strange people sometimes. And we have Anna, right? So here we have Anna's demand function. And essentially what it says that the higher the price, the less he wants, right? That is why it's curved this way, and the same is true for Brewster. For a very high price of 5, he doesn't want anything, but if the price falls, he actually wants to get more of the stuff. And then their total demand, the demand of Anna and Brewster together, is this function here, right? Initially, Brewster's demand curve dominates, but at a certain price, Anna also wants her share of the goods, right? And then actually always trading off between the two. And essentially what you have is here you have Brewster's demand curve, and then here we essentially have Anna's demand curve translated. But of course this is a mix of the two together. And this is called vertical aggregation of demands. And this is how we typically, how you have earlier on seen how we move from individual demand curves to aggregate demand curves, right? For a public good, because it's non-rival, it is not the case that if Brewster buys it, Anna can't, right? They both can have it. So what you need to do is at every point, you need to add the two. Rather than at every price point say, well, now it goes, this marginal product goes to Brewster, and then the next point it goes to Anna. What you do in a public good is that, no, at this price point, Anna wants so much and Brewster wants so much, and we just add it up, right? So what we have here is that Brewster starts at 5, Anna starts at 2.5, so the sum total starts at 7.5, right? That's where the demand curve starts. And then at price, I think this is 12, Brewster drops out of the market, but Anna remains in the market, right? And therefore we see this kink here. And we have Anna's demand curve who is dominating. Here we have actually Brewster's demand curve, or the demands. Brewster's steepness determines the steepness of the curve. Here it's Anna's steepness, and actually Anna is the only one in the market, right, at this particular point. But at every point it is the sum of the two that sort of gets you there, right? It's this particular axis that we add up rather than this particular axis that we add up, right? So that is how you construct a demand curve for a public good. It's horizontal aggregation rather than vertical aggregation. Or that is what I think, that is what I wrote down. I'm the sort of guy who doesn't know left from right and has that to a very severe degree. So I may also occasionally swap my horizontal and vertical, right? Because it's the same to me. Now, if you compare the two, right? So we have a demand curve here for a private good. Here we have a demand curve for a public good. Let's put them in a graph together. Here we have the private goods. Here we have the public good. And what you see is that they're very clearly different, right? You actually saw that from here already. Now we're in the same graph and they're very different. Then if we add a supply curve, that is assumed the same for both, then what you actually see is that the demand for the non-rival good is greater than the demand for the rival good, right? Or the equilibrium point is greater for the non-rival good than for the rival good, right? So that is what Samuelson figured out. Lindahl took this a step further and said, well, that Samuelson condition that it's not the marginal rate of substitution that must equal the marginal rate of transformation, but it's the sum of the marginal rate of substitutions that must equal the marginal rate of transformation. Lindahl noted, well, the sum of the marginal rate of substitution is really the marginal price that everybody wants to pay, right? And what matters is not in the market what sort of the marginal consumer wants to pay at that point, but what matters in the market is what all of us at that point, or each of us at that point, wants to pay at the margin. And that is the total demand. It's the sum of our marginal willingnesses to pay. And this is known as the Lindahl equilibrium, where the marginal rate of transformation is equal to not the market price, but the sum of our individual prices. Right? Not the substitution of our individual prices. It's not that I am the highest bidder and therefore it goes to me. No, we all bid at the margin, and then what matters is the sum total of our bids. Not the highest bidder, but the sum total of the bids, right? Now that is the Lindahl equilibrium, which works beautifully in theory, right? But the idea that we could know the individual willingnesses to pay of everybody at the margin for public goods is, of course, very, very far-fetched, right? So this works in theory, but really it can't work in practice. Beautiful math, but that's it. Now, what do public goods do to the market, right? Let's assume that we have an economy with n agents and they're all identical. And let's assume that utility of each of the agents depends on the wages that we get and the total supply of a public good G, right? And it's another way of writing this is that G bar is how much all other people provide in terms of the public good, and small g is how much this particular individual provides towards the public good. And of course, once you do that, you have less money left for private consumption, and you have to subtract your contribution to the public good from your private consumption, right? And then because everybody is identical, this G bar is of course just equal to n minus 1 times G, right? Because everybody does the same thing. Now, where does the indifference curve run in sort of the space of our private contribution to the public good and the contribution of all other agents in the economy to the public good, right? That is on this axis, the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we have the small g. This is the total amount that we can spend. Now in this situation, let's start with a situation where the contribution of all others in the economy to the public good is relatively small, right? In this situation here, what you would do is the amount you spend is essentially all your income goes to providing for yourself, everything goes to the private good. But if everybody else contributes very little, then really what you would want to do is sacrifice a little bit of your private consumption in order to have more of a public good, right? So you can sort of imagine that you live on a road with lots of potholes and you really get annoyed with the potholes, and what you do is you at least kind of fill up the potholes in front of your own house, right? And that would be worth your while because that is the stretch of road that you drive the most and would kill your tires. So you would be willing to give up something of your own private consumption in order to provide the public good. A little bit, right? Not a lot. So the indifference curve must run down here, right? Similarly, if you're in this situation here, where essentially you do not consume anything in private, all your money goes to providing the public good, you actually say, at that point, I'm gonna be a little bit more selfish, I'm gonna buy more stuff that just benefits me. So also at this point, the indifference curve must run down, right? Now, if it's downward sloping here, if it's downward sloping here, then it must be flat somewhere here, right? That just follows from what I just said. So this is one particular situation. Now we can contrast that with other situations in which the others provide more of the public good. Now if the others provide more of the public good, then your utility goes up, right? Because essentially you get something that you like for free, right? So utility goes up. So we're moving in this direction. And actually at this particular situation, U4, the others provide so much of the public good that there's absolutely no reason for you to contribute as well, right? Your contribution to the public good is zero. So the optima for the different situations is all where this thing goes flat, right? So your best response curve to the action of others is this curve that you see here, right? So this is your best private response, what is in your best interest in response to, in terms of how much you provide public goods and how much money you keep to yourself, in response to what the others in the economy provide in terms of the public good, right? This is your best response. Now, if we contrast that to the supply, right? The slope of this curve, had I drawn it to scale, would be n minus 1, right? This is where supply meets demand, right? Where it touches the curve is where marginal supply equals marginal utility, right? So this point here, E, is the social optimum, but this point, well, N is the market equilibrium, right? So this illustrates that if we go for the private provision, the voluntary contributions to a public good, then the rational response of everyone in the economy is to supply less than the social optimum, right? That is what this graph shows. Now, do we see this in reality? Yes. So I've made these points before, right? This is a neat example. So we're off the coast of Australia. No, we're off the coast of Argentina. God. And the question is about fisheries, right? So as I said, every country has an exclusive economic zone, and what you can do in that exclusive economic zone is you can say, you Spanish fishermen, you Chinese fishermen, you're not allowed. These are Argentine waters, right? Only Argentine fishing is allowed. But as soon as you move beyond the 200 nautical miles, not miles, it's actually a free-for-all. So what you would expect is that everybody would fish as much as they can outside the exclusive economic zone in the open ocean, but not in the exclusive economic zone. So this is the boundary. There it is. My laptop was thinking about something else. So this is Argentina. This is the exclusive economic zone of Argentina. This is the exclusive economic zone of the Falkland Islands, right? What we see here is the transponders of the fishing vessels that tell you where the fishing boats are, and they are always in satellite contact, and they tell you the exact GPS coordinates of all these fishing vessels. It's hard to see sort of on the map if you sort of like draw it as a distance. This is the boundary of the exclusive economic zone fishing activity, or rather the number of fishing boats on the high seas versus the number of fishing boats in the exclusive economic zone, where fish are something of a private property, at least from Argentina, whereas here they belong to everybody, right? Here it's truly non-excludable. Here it's sort of a public good within a sovereign nation. You see very sharp difference, right? The fishing boats are on the high seas, not on the in the exclusive economic zone. Now you can argue, I don't trust these transponders because fisher people can't be trusted and they're always messing with these transponders. They're also all falsifying the data, or they accidentally break. An alternative way of doing is to look with satellites and if you're at night, what you do on a boat is you turn on the lights, right? And those cannot be hidden. And you can see these ships from the satellite. And here you see the picture. And you see certain areas clearly lit up. If you then plot this as a function of the distance to the boundary of the exclusive economic zone, you see the same thing happening again, a little bit stronger even. So it is clear that the pattern also holds with a true measure of where the fishing boats are, at least at night, right? So this particular prediction of theory seems to hold up, at least in this particular case, and there's many more examples, right? So how do we go about this thing? How do you provide for public goods? Well, really the only way to provide public goods is to provide them from the tax revenue, right? If you have a public good, then somebody needs to pay for that, and the only one with an interest in doing so is the state, right? It does not mean that the state has to provide the public good in the sense that it delivers the services, but the state has to pay for it, right? And immediately you run into problems in situations where there is no government, right? If you're talking about international public goods like the open sea, where there is no government. But within a country, this is the only way to do it. With common goods, the problem is overgrazing, right? Over access. So somehow you need to limit the number of sheep that can go on there, or if you're talking about fishing about fishing, then you need to introduce some sort of limit on the total amount of fish that can be taken. And one solution would be to create artificial scarcity by creating permits for this activity, rather than making it a free-for-all. Create a permit. For club goods, also known congestion goods, the problem there is that yes, you can exclude people from your venue, but if you want to maximize your revenue, then of course, and you've all been there, you're going to admit more people to your bar or to your club than really is safe or pleasant, right? So there the solution would be to tax use, right? Another example here are roads, right? Roads are not public goods, roads are club goods. No, roads are common goods, right? Because you can't forbid me to drive on the road, but if my car is there, your car can't be, because I've taken up the space, right? So there one solution would be to tax road use, right? To prevent congestion is to introduce road pricing. So there's solution to all of these things. Some are politically acceptable, some are harder to get through, some are very esoteric, but it can all be done. This is just a summary. So that was it for today. I hope to see you guys on Monday. Recall, Monday we are online in the seminar. I'll send an email around where exactly you need to be, and then I hope to see you again live next Tuesday.